everybody. Reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
So our technology is focused on heat exchange. And so we try to find all of the ways that we can dissipate heat energy from the parcel of incoming air without using energy. Since the moment that we're able to lower the temperature of the air to the dew point, then we can condensate that water. And so the less energy input we need to do that, the better. Some of the ways we do that is through various methods of ambient heat exchange. For example, using things like heat pipes allows us to transfer energy away from the parcel of air without inputting energy. And we use a bunch of different techniques or different components that allows us to do that before we actually use the condensation chambers themselves, which requires electricity. So by doing both together, then we're able to dramatically decrease the amount of energy needed to produce that water.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Brian Sheng, co-founder and CEO of Aquaria. Welcome to the show today.
Thanks for having me, Scott. Super excited to be on the podcast.
So my understanding is that in your high school career, you played football, specifically defensive end and tackle, and even won the county championship. You also played at Princeton as well.
I did.
What were your hopes and aspirations when it came to football?
Oh, well, I came to America as an immigrant when I was in elementary school. And so I think football became my way. I thought of very quickly integrating into, American society. It was something that I'm also very into competing. And so, I think along the way, I really became in love with the sport. And at some point, I thought I wanted to be in the NFL. Of course, that didn't happen. But took me all the way to playing football at the collegiate level, and I think that was quite enough for me at that point.
Over your career, did you have any injuries that would have potentially impeded your continued career should you have pursued it?
Yeah, luckily I can say that currently, even as we stand here today, I don't think I have any leftover injuries from playing those in the football day. But at the time, there were a concussion, one or two there.
Yeah, it's a tough sport. Well, we're going to come back to this thematic of sports and competition in just a few minutes. You got involved with China's largest VC, SCGC, as an analyst, I believe, and you were working there for about 3 months or so. Can you tell us about that work you did and how that eventually spun out to you sourcing American startups for Chinese investors?
So I actually worked at SGC's Shenzhen Capital Group when I was a senior in high school. So that actually gave me my first look at kind of the startup world. I was doing this internship. I was in Silicon Valley. I was in Shenzhen, and I realized that having grown up in New York, that actually I had no idea what the startup world is like in China. So of course, then I focused my attention on Silicon Valley. That had a huge impact on my career because I actually started Fresh VC, which was kind of what I did after that, as a freshman in college. I actually dropped out of Princeton for 2 years to build this venture capital firm that continued to build out my portfolio. So that had a huge impact on my career.
So tell us about how you raised capital as a freshman in college that took some time off.
So at the time, if you remember, there was a movie called The Social Network. And so as a freshman in college, I had this crazy idea and said, well, I'm really bought into the idea that younger people can build companies with a purpose, with a mission, and build really large businesses. And so I went to a lot of Princeton alumni. I went to a lot of older I guess, speakers that were coming to the school. And I said, okay, you know what? I'm going to go find the next Mark Zuckerberg. And, I'm not at Harvard, at Princeton. I'm sure we can find Mark Zuckerbergs from Princeton too. And so went to lots of Princeton alumni. And eventually, some of them were crazy enough to give me a little bit of money to get started. The technology that got us started actually came from my own thesis research. My own thesis research at Princeton was on distributed energy and water infrastructure. And so that gave me kind of a lot of ideas and gave me a lot of the foundation to be able to go out there and figure out, okay, who's actually building something tangential to what later on, right, what Aquaria would be. But earlier on, I took that opportunity to really kind of map out the entire space of who's doing anything in distributed energy and who's doing anything in distributed water. And along the way, of course, the professors at Princeton, gave me lots of ideas and feedback on, what I was thinking about. And so, we're a technology company and we're really focusing on R&D and building the next generation of large scale, atmospheric water capture devices. We're not a manufacturing company, and the way I think about it is kind of like Apple and Foxconn. We're doing a lot of the design R&D, and right now, in order for us to grow capital efficient as a capital efficient company, we're able to really leverage the power of manufacturing from the Shenzhen side, from the FND side, and has been a really great relationship so far.
Gotcha. All right, understood. So let's get into the company. So what is Aquaria and what exactly is it trying to solve?
Yeah. We are building a sustainable and secure source of clean water for cities in a time where we are running out. And the problem we're trying to solve is that when we look at our resources, we have many different forms of energy, but we have very few forms of water available to us other than building large scale infrastructure, which takes a ton of capital and takes a lot of time to implement, and which is usually done by our municipalities or the government, which is totally fine, except we need more options because we're experiencing more frequent and varying types of water problem. Maybe it's contamination, maybe it's drought, and maybe it's a natural disaster. And we need more solutions to provide water. And that's what Aquaria is solving. It's doing that by harvesting air.
So what's interesting is that because you're trying to solve this existing issue around, let's say, desalination, of course, is it can be very capital intensive and OpEx intensive as well, especially if you're trying to supply fresh water source for a metropolitan area. So you're looking at decentralized, smaller footprint that's modular. Talk to us about specific use cases that relates to retail, commercial, and developer use cases.
Yeah. What we found, and this is where we're getting started with, is really targeting residential communities, especially as we're building more and more developments in the southern US. There's lots of areas that are just simply running out of a secure source of water supply. You can imagine a community of 50, 100, even a couple hundred homes, and the complexity necessary to build out a desalination plant specifically for that. It might not even be possible, right, Scott? Like if you're in Austin, Texas, where they're doing a lot of developments, there's not really an ocean nearby. You would have to, pipe water from other areas, tens, if not hundreds of miles away. And so instead, you can put in atmospheric water generators powered by solar and generate that water right where you are.
Now, one of the things you mentioned was in your thesis, you talked about the fact of decentralization and decentralized grid, energy storage, and of course, water is one thing. Have you thought about how that could eventually have capabilities for energy storage in addition to the atmospheric water capture?
Oh, yes, absolutely, Scott. I think that's a great point that you just brought up because energy and water are so intertwined. And there's a couple of different ways to do it, without getting too technical here. We've thought about, okay, when there's extra solar power, which is now frequently the case, during the daytime, there's excess solar capacity. We can actually potentially store that in the form of hydrogen molecules if we're using that for electrolysis when there's extra power in the grid. We've also thought about using extra solar power in the form of a thermal battery storage, heating up the water so that the water becomes another form of energy storage. So that's not what we're currently today, since our mission right now is really focused on large scale water for the sake of providing clean water to the people. But that's definitely come up, in our mind and some of our partners. So I think it's a really great point, Scott.
So I know that we've had on our show other startups, including those that are looking to take or augment existing HVAC infrastructure for carbon capture and sequestration. In your case, is there a possibility that you could either play off the existing infrastructure of HVAC and specifically the fan, where the fan can be augmented to have some of your capability versus having another unit?
Yeah, absolutely. This, I think, is a much closer evolution of our application than, let's say, the kind of energy storage we talked about before. I think energy storage has huge potential, but so does HVAC. And obviously, especially in hotter areas where our technology also works better, HVAC is has a huge carbon footprint. Essentially, we actually use very similar principles, but it's optimizing for very different technical results. For HVAC, it's about cooling load. And for us, it's about maximizing water extraction. If you look at an HVAC unit, right, it does also have a condensate, like a small amount of condensate production, which you can't drink, but it does still have that small of condensate. So we are looking at and thinking about, like, is there a way for us to kind of optimize so that it has a dual usage? Although at this point, we're not sure exactly how we're able to do it because of the range of kind of temperatures that are involved. So that's something we're going to look into in the later stages. But right now, again, we're just focused on producing clean water.
Well, I think certainly down the road, it's interesting to explore the possibility of licensing some of your patents and proprietary technology because of the fact that there are some commonalities, right? The fact that both are pulling air into the system. Now, of course, the air filtration system is a little bit segmented for traditional HVAC. Here, you would have to bring it up closer. But again, instead of trying to build a full outright complete unit, you could still slice a particular portion of the licensing to existing HVAC manufacturers so they can incorporate some of these capabilities. Is that a revenue stream that you guys would consider at some point?
I'm not sure. I don't really think the licensing and commercialization model is particularly effective for the speed of innovation unless you have find a really good team to do it. I think, like, working with larger corporate innovation, unless it's like in the reverse where the corporation is supporting a startup and the team is able to move in a very very fast execution pace. So I think it's situation dependent. If we can find the right partners for commercialization, then perhaps I think it's going to be dependent on the partners.
Now, let's get into a little bit of the technology. We talked a little bit about air filtration, just a bit around the removal of dust and dirt particles. Talk to us about this patented ambient heat exchange technology that's then condensing the humidity from the air into liquid water.
Yeah. So our technology is focused on heat exchange. And so we try to find all of the ways that we can dissipate heat energy from the parts of incoming air without using energy. Since the moment that we're able to lower the temperature of the air to the dew point, then we can condensate that water. And so the less energy input we need to do that, the better. Some of the ways we do that is through various methods of ambient heat exchange. For example, using things like heat pipes allows us to transfer energy away from the parcel of air without inputting energy. And we use a bunch of different techniques or different components that allows us to do that before we actually use the condensation chambers themselves, which requires electricity. So by doing both together, then we're able to dramatically decrease the amount of energy needed to produce that water.
Can you talk to us about some of the limitations in terms of range? Across the globe, there are varying different types of arid, dryness, as well as even temperature and variations. Where is it optimal and where are some of the constraints?
Yeah. So the current direction of our technology R&D is really focused on high volume production, or I should really say ultra high volume production and production density in areas of medium or higher, or I should say low, medium, or higher humidity, meaning we need at least 25% relative humidity for us to make a meaningful amount of water, which makes us in areas under 20. So, for example, maybe Nevada and Las Vegas in the desert, or maybe in parts of Arizona. Those would be environments that we're not keen to go into, since our technology would not be able to make as much water. Our thesis is that we want to solve problems with water at scale. And right now we're making the trade-off that there's plenty of water challenges in areas over 25% humidity, and we can help solve that if our technology can make enough water to support entire communities and cities, which is a very large technical challenge to be able to produce that much water from the air.
You were talking about hydropixel and hydropack technology that you were talking about that claims up to 264 gallons per day. There's a lot of different criteria that plays into that equation. So some place like, let's say, Austin is going to be very different from, let's say, different parts of Florida because of the range of humidity, range of temperature, for instance, and of course, seasonality as well. So how do you go about computing that? And then we haven't talked about the software piece and the analytics of this particular kind of overall platform.
Yeah. So the software piece actually plays directly into this, is that our software is able to take into account weather forecasting data. It looks at the temperature and humidity of the particular region that it's sitting in, and then also takes into account, like, for example, energy demand and forecast data, the price of that energy if you're not using solar, which would strongly affect the price of your production, right? If you're producing at daytime versus nighttime, peak versus off peak, there's a difference in your power pricing if it's not on solar. So we take into all that into account, and then we try to optimize the production so that you're getting the most amount of water for the least amount of cost on your end. And so, yes, there's definitely a variance. And so our production kind of range, we do a consultation with all of our customers to make sure that what we're giving them is sufficient for them.
So I'm thinking about the kind of prioritization of use cases that have the highest level of urgency or the demand. So I think about places where they are hit by a natural disaster. So take Haiti or DR or other parts where they've been hit by hurricanes, and it affects their infrastructure, their water system in particular. And one of the first things that happens is their drinkable water becomes almost non-existent or it becomes contaminated. In that regard, how are you looking to potentially partner with like the UN, Army Corps, other types of large entities that are deploying things in a very remote or in places where there's been significant natural disasters?
Yeah, I think a lot of that is about education and awareness of our technology, and that, of Aquaria, or it doesn't have to be Aquaria, but of the solution and implementing that in the field. And hopefully that there are, audience members, Scott, on the podcast who hears about this and gives them maybe a bright light bulb that goes off. We are actually currently working on a pilot project with both Stanford University atmospheric science program to test our technology for its use case, improving its use case for the Army Corps of Engineers. We would love to work with other organizations like the UN and Red Cross and other response agencies. We're a little bit limited by our abilities as a startup currently and how many people we have, and to be able to have a huge presence. And that's why we're working on expanding our education awareness right now. But we welcome people from these organizations that come to us, and we're actively reaching out to them to strike up these partnerships.
So speaking of some of the projects underway, there's also some deployments happening in Mexico City. And if you could also talk about a residential community that you guys are supplying some water to, right?
Yeah, exactly. The first community project that we're doing right now is in Hawaii, and we're solving the challenge of providing clean water because the local water supply is contaminated, and building a desalination plant is both too costly and possibly not even permitted. So we're providing solar-based atmospheric water generator there, obviously because it's very hot and humid in Hawaii, and then we're able to provide a less pollutive and less carbon intensive solution there. And for Mexico, well, Mexico City right now in particular is heading towards I think, according to the media, they would call it day zero. They're running out of water as we speak, and hopefully it rains. But short of that, we've been getting lots of inquiries from Mexico City to provide a new source of water, since the city is literally kind of trickling away and running out of water as we speak.
So I think the two biggest things that I am still kind of struggling with is the fact that I think there are specific kind of edge cases where Aquaria is really most suitable, like some of this kind of backup or emergency disaster relief type of a situation. But when we think about large scale things that can actually supply water to entire Southern California, for example, or to Nevada, in the case of Mexico, even, this Mexico is made up of a lot of different territories, and they're very different in geography and temperature and humidity. Similar to carbon capture and sequestration, and I think about Climeworks and other types of human engineer solutions, to scale to the point where it's going to actually make any type of material difference, it's just going to be really tough. It's going to be really hard. I get that this is modular. I get that it's small. But at the same time, can you really envision this thing powering an entire metropolitan area?
Absolutely. And we've already worked out how that actually works. The varying degree of temperature and humidity fluctuates, but it's not as if we're targeting area where it's fluctuating between 5 and 15%. You look at the average temperature and humidity of many regions of Texas, Mexico, where we're talking about, and we're looking at solving problems for places that average 40, 50, 60%. And that's a lot of a lot of humidity in the air for us to work with. So then the question then becomes for us, what is the large scale solution that we provide to supply in let's say, an entire metropolitan area? And that comes down to two things. What is the power source? And then how much space do you need? So actually, we've already worked out that in order to provide a facility that is needed to get enough water from the air to supply 1 million people, we need a space that's roughly, about 120,000 square meters, which is about a quarter of the size of a Tesla gigafactory. So it's possible. It's just, how do we demonstrate to stakeholders as we continue to scale up the company to build a bigger and bigger facility over time? Because as we are today, we're building community scale, a couple hundred homes. That's a little bit far from building a facility for 1 million plus people. So the math and the work has been done to show that it's possible. So now it's for us to execute on that and scale over time.
The follow-up question related to that is project finance. So how are Wall Street and those that are packaging some of these kind of green bonds and other types of structured finance products, how are they looking at this? And do they feel like this is an equivalency to things that's out there in terms of different types of water capture?
Yeah, I think the parallel with solar is very clear there. Although we're still in the early days, we actually already found a partner who's actually supporting us with project financing. And this summer, we're actively looking for a project where we can use that project financing and prove out this model. I think actually the first project we'll use that with is in Mexico. So hopefully in 3 months, Scott, when you ask me that question, I can tell you that actually we've already done our first project where we're using project financing to prove out this model. Again, I think it's part of the early innovators' journey is we've lined up the pieces and now we have to go execute on it.
I know we've intentionally kind of avoided dry, arid places, but let's talk about Saudi Arabia with specifically the line. We're talking about a massive infrastructure that spans the width of the nation in a very hot desert climate. Would something like this even be feasible? And to what extent will it actually produce water?
Sure. So for the line based in Neom, I believe, in Saudi Arabia, it would be feasible because for Saudi Arabia, not the entire country is dry. And also, when a place has very hot temperature, if it has water reserves, it also evaporates, which causes the ground dryness or lack of water. But evaporation is exactly what we're capturing. So for lots of places, it doesn't necessarily equate what people think of as dry as where Aquaria is able to function. This is on top of the fact that Neom is actually fairly close to bodies of water. And so for a place like Neom and the line, yeah, absolutely. We're engaging, we're trying to engage with them right now. We just spoke with actually one of the Neom fund and we had the same exact conversation. Like, hey, look, you guys are building new infrastructure, and I'm sure you're considering various options. There are definitely different parts of your development that should use atmospheric water generation to help you build a smaller carbon footprint, spend less capital, and get it up faster. And so I think these are some great examples that would help paint an aspirational picture of, well, what does atmospheric water look at scale?
Now, there's one area that we have completely neglected, but I want to make sure that we spend some time briefly on it, is that farming is a real issue. And if you look at just America alone, we've not only tapped out the water tables, the middle of America is getting drier and drier. And so much of our crop and things that we depend on, including biofuel, is coming from those regions where these farmers are in very serious trouble because of water scarcity. How can this solution potentially solve some of the persistent structural issues around agriculture, not just in the US, but around the world as well?
Yeah, I think it comes down to cost. It all comes down to what is the cost to provide that water, and to what use case. I think in the case of agriculture, we could definitely help with providing additional water for farming. And we actually have some farmers who were using and recycling water using atmospheric water generators. But I think the best solution for agriculture may not be us. Actually, I saw this company the other day out of, I believe, the Netherlands called Desalinator. And they're using solar-powered desalination in the desert where it's not based off of membrane distillation.
Mhm.
And they were growing crops in Abu Dhabi based off of their kind of novel solar-powered desal plants. I actually think it really depends on what resources you have locally. If you're in a super hot, super hot, super humid region, and you have needs right on where you are, yeah, atmospheric water can make sense. If you're in a region in the middle of nowhere and the air might not be as humid, but you have the ocean next to you, maybe that's a better option. So I think it's very specific to what resources you also have available to you, and then looking at what the best option for water for that particular use case will be. And hopefully one of those options is Aquaria.
Well, personally, again, in the East Coast where we live, we get water from under the ground. So we don't even need to tap into the utility system. But for places like California, where there are seriously hindered by water infrastructure, I would love to see something like this where it gets built into the building permits, where maybe it's not mandated, but it's highly encouraged so that builders as well as contractors are thinking about some of these things. And of course, this is all in the context of what we talked about earlier, is decentralization. Ultimately, decentralized solutions where energy, storage, water is going to make the overall system much more resilient to disasters. And of course, we haven't talked about it, but related to all of this is going to be home insurance, business insurance, and just a lack of affordability, both ends for the payers, but also the insurers as well. With that, I have been joined by Brian Sheng, CEO of Aquaria. Thanks for joining today.
This is great. Thank you so much for having me, Scott.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.